I hate radiators.
I hate radiators.
I hate radiators! Pure chaos. It's here, ladies and gentlemen, can you believe it? The RTX 4060 Ti has arrived. And you know what? This is the first graphics card that we've had in a long time that is borderline affordable. Hooray! Emphasis on the word borderline though, because this still cost $399, which in one way is quite good because this actually is the exact same price that the RTX 3060 Ti launched for, and that was actually one of my favorite cards. The performance of that was excellent, and this looks to have around about 12% extra rasterized performance, which is what you're going to use in like your multiplayer games. But once you factor in things like DLSS 3.0, your frame rate can quite literally go through the roof. Now obviously the card you're seeing here is not the Founders Edition. This is one of the Storm X cards from Palette, and essentially this looks to be geared towards ITX builds. And yes, this is the brand stinking new 2000D Airflow from Corsair. More on this a little bit later into this video. But back to the card at hand, and this is pretty unremarkable really. Hopefully in a good way, because I personally am a big fan of smaller size cards. We'll have to wait and see whether the thermal and acoustic performance is up to snuff. But otherwise, this is one that will be available for MSRP. You should be able to do some light overclocking with the software. And in terms of I/O, it's pretty much the same as all of the other NVIDIA cards, which is 3 DisplayPort 1.4s and then 1 HDMI 2.1. So if you want to do 4K 120 output on a TV or something like that, you can still do it with this card, but it's not really going to have the horsepower to drive that in anything other than really old titles. The only other thing to do before we get our build on is to draw your attention to the top of the card, and you'll see that this is not a 12-volt high power connection. This is just a standard 8-pin, which should make upgrading your older GPU a lot easier. But enough about our 4060 Ti, at least for now. It's time to actually get our build on and talk about this, the 2000D Airflow. This is an ITX chassis. I'm hoping that this should be very similar to the Meshlicious, which is currently my favorite ITX case out there because it's just very smart in the way it uses its space. Like the volume is tall, which means it doesn't actually take up very much space on your desks, your living room, wherever you're going to put it, yet it can still accommodate quite a lot of hardware. But the only problem with that is that graphics cards have grown and that chassis, generally speaking, has not. They've added a couple of centimeters in a recent update, but otherwise, if you do want to use like a super high-end graphics card, you're slightly out of luck there. Whereas with this, I think they've pretty much covered all bases. But enough talk, let's actually properly show you what we're doing. We've removed the side panels that also feel very good. They've got mesh, they've got full ventilation on both sides. This whole front, I believe, will also remove. As it does, and you can see you've got your I/O down the bottom, you've got one USB-C, two USB 3. Then on this higher end RGB version, you do get 3 fans as standard. These are RGB, but fundamentally these are actually low profile. And if you look at it from the other side, you'll see you also have this like protective mesh on the back. So if you do have a load of cables like flailing about, there's a lot less chance of them actually going into the fans themselves, which is something I've seen many times before when building ITX cases, so that's always nice to see. I don't think this is necessarily going to be the simplest build out there, but as long as you're following the instructions, I don't think this is going to take too long. The smaller you go, the more complicated it can be, but I have faith in Corsair. I hate radiators! Rightio then, let's get our build on, shall we? To gain access, let's remove this little fan bracket. Then on the inside we have all of these cables, and I think it's worse because this is the RGB version, and in ITX, cables are your enemy. You want as few as possible. If you look at the top right-hand corner of this chassis, you'll see we have this little IQ fan hub here, and this is one of the premium features that you'll find on the RGB version of this. I don't believe you get that on the base version. So what I'm going to do is put this to a side for 1 second, and then pick up our motherboard and start building on the box. And the one we've got here, I haven't actually used before. This is the B650i Aorus Ultra. This is of course an AM5 compatible motherboard, so it is going to use DDR5 memory, which can get pricey, but to be honest, there has been a lot of price drops recently, so it's not that much worse. But here you can see is our pretty high-end B650 motherboard. There's definitely a lot going on here if you want to put like a Gen 5 SSD. Yeah, Gen 5 SSD on an ITX motherboard. That is going to be a lot of heat to deal with, so I guess you're going to need loads of fans. I'll whack this under the overhead though, because one thing I will draw your attention to is the fact that there are not masses of USB Type A ports on this. I think this is one of the limitations with going with ITX, or at least using the bandwidth for other things. But let's drop this on top of our motherboard box, and we're going to open up this top slot. which is of course used for our CPU. And speak of the devil, and he shall appear, the one we're using today is the 7600. And you can go higher end, you can go 7700, 7800 X3D, or even loads more cores with something like a 7950X. But for gaming at this sort of level, I do think this is going to be more than sufficient really. If you want to go for the 7700, I think that's a fair upgrade. You get 2 extra cores. But personally speaking, if you're trying to save money, especially if you've got to spend extra on your power supply and the more expensive case, this is a decent way of not really affecting your frame rate, but indeed lowering down your costs. So let's get this out of the box and gently line it up before lowering it back down and clipping it into place. In terms of the memory we're using, we are going for RGB because I do think it will look slightly better even through the mesh. But to be honest, if you do want to save yourself some money and lose the RGB, this is definitely a chassis you're not really going to notice. I guess it depends more on your personal preferences. This is a 32GB kit running at 5600 megahertz, and this does come with an AMD Expo profile, so you should get the best possible compatibility. It is always worth updating your BIOS though on a new board like this, as this can help with memory compatibility. And then comes what looks to be a bit of a mission, which is to actually access our SSD bays, because these are vertically stacked. I mean, Gen 4 drives got pretty hot, but PCI Gen 5 looks to be even more insane. So essentially you have all of this thermal mass on the motherboard to sort of absorb that heat from all of the peak usage, and then hopefully you'll have fans that will be able to get this heat away. For this particular build, it shouldn't actually make any difference which slot you're using, but if you are using one of these super fast Gen 5 slots, remember there's only one on this board, so make sure you're putting it in the right slot. And then you can go ahead and pick up your SSD, and the one we're using here is the Rocket 4 Plus. This is a Gen 4 drive. It's not the fastest, but for gaming, personally, I don't think it's going to make masses of difference, but do always check the offers, because you can often get faster drives than this that are on specialty sale for slightly less, but then again, this is usually available at a very good price. Then you can pick up this massive heatsink. So they got a fan in it. It does. There you go. That's why it's so thick. There's this tiny little fan here, look, which is clearly going to be needed for Gen 5, especially on an RTX motherboard. And then you can just go ahead and stick it all back together. Hi everyone, sorry to interrupt and to ruin the continuity. I've realized I didn't have a very nice segue into today's mid-roll, so this is it. Here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Oh, I'm so bad at my job. Now, I've been creating videos on this channel for over 10 years, and one of my favorite tools, hands down, has to be Epidemic Sound. Epidemic Sound is the creator's go-to resource for restriction-free music and sound effects, with affordable plans, clear and simple licensing, and a huge library of 40,000 audio tracks and 90,000 sound effects. Unlike built-in libraries, Epidemic Sound lets you find unique soundtracks for your content that can be published and monetized across all online platforms, saving you time and keeping your creative vision intact. I also love that there's an absolutely fantastic recommendation system on here, so if you're finding you're using the same sort of tracks a little bit too often, you're being a bit lazy, you can give this a whirl, it'll give you some alternatives, and it will make your videos just sound a whole lot fresher. There are different plans available depending on your size and structure, so you can save money regardless of whether you're a freelancer, small company, or full-blown enterprise. I'm on the commercial plan, which lets me use the music and ad reads like this, as well as content created for any third-party clients. It's been my personal go-to service for years, and there's no reason it can't be yours either. Just hit the link down in the description below for a 30-day free trial to discover the wealth of tracks available, and best of all, everything's protected, even if you cancel. And at this point, we're now ready to actually put this inside our case. So here's hoping it's going to be smooth from this point onwards. Unfortunately, there's only one way you can actually drop this in. It does seem a little bit unusual, but the I/O will actually face downwards, and then you can connect everything through this little hole at the back here. It's going to be more fiddly than a traditional PC, but to be honest, how often do you actually like fiddle with all of the back ones when you've got like top or bottom USB ports? Not that often. Then we can screw it down. Oh, and then everything will start to become quite clear, because of course there's no PCIe riser cable with this or anything. You are quite literally natively picking up your graphics card and slotting it in the bottom down here. And now I actually feel a little bit silly for going with such a small GPU, because while it is still going to help, you've got more room for other things, we could have put something much larger in here. But if you wanted to go for a Founders Edition card, this is a 4080, I think you might be in luck, look. Oh, that is tight though. But yeah, I think actually that would work. I mean, I say that, I would definitely be very cautious around this top power connection. If you have like a right angle one, you should be okay. But I think if you're using adapter This has a little bit more room to go down, but I think that would actually be a bit too restrictive for my liking. But I think you can make it work, that's the point. I was actually about to start plugging in a load of cables, but I've realized that you have all of these little adapters that actually come with the motherboard box. Hang on a minute, we've got adapters going into adapters, almost going into adapters. This is not particularly user-friendly, I'm afraid, Gigabyte. I understand why, but it's not ideal. I very quickly decided that putting the graphics card in was not a sensible choice. Well, that was definitely a little bit of a weird 15-20 minutes. I think once you've got to grips with how the case works, then everything actually is pretty good. The only thing I will say is that obviously the combination of all of those like Gigabyte, triple stacking, everything, extender, cable things, does make it a little bit more complicated. And if you did want to mod this and add like a tempered glass side panel, you've not really got many places to neatly tidy everything. We can sort of tuck some cables up here, but you're definitely going to have some mess. The only other things that we do need to now plug in are, of course, our SATA cables, which does mean installing the power supply. And I would strongly imagine that our PSU will go up here. It looks like a very large hole, though. And I guess this is because it supports FSX-L power supplies, not ATX. You will need to buy something a little bit smaller. And the one that we've got here is from Seasonic. This is the SPX 750. At the time of filming, this is around about 140, 150 pounds. So it's definitely not the cheapest thing. We've already mentioned this. If you want to save money, don't buy ITX, go for even micro ATX, that can be a lot cheaper. But of course the question on everybody's minds is, does this fit in this hole? Yes, it does. So because you've got this mesh side panel on the side, you want the fan facing outwards, and then this way it has its own chamber of air that it can just direct in and out. So that should work quite well. And then all of your cables come down here. And I like the fact that they have given you this little gap. So if you do need to quickly plug some cables or take something out, it is at least a little bit easier than it would be in a lot of ITX chassis. Let's get all of these cables plugged into the supply, and then we can get this screwed in nice and safe and secure. And then I guess we can start plugging things in. Will it look neat? My money's on no. Turn it over and assess the damage. I told you it wasn't gonna look good. Look, this is a mess. I mean, it's fine. I'm telling you, if you were to build in the Cooler Master NR200P, it would look very similar to this without a lot of careful attention. But with that, I think it's time to install the final component that I wouldn't usually do last, but because this is ITX, it's clearly going to have to go on last. This is the Antex Vortex 240, and I don't think you're even going to need this personally. I actually would probably go for an air cooler here, because you've got so much room. Just obviously check the specifications before you buy it. Oh, I've just realized I've got to friggin' add another one of these extension cables to the motherboard, and that means unplugging all of this. Oh, it's just such a faff, isn't it? RGB as well. Anyway, I'd rather it was me that suffered than you, so I'm just going to install this AM4 and AM5 mounting hardware to the cooler. I hate radiators.
I hate radiators.
Oh, my life. So okay, I've now attached the fans and they're going to be blowing out of the chassis. This is going to be the moment of truth. Is this going to work? You got to hold this whilst doing all of this. It's an absolute shambles. It really is. I hate radiators. Pure chaos. This is the reality of building ITX. I'm not going to make this look easy, because it's not. I'm almost certainly bending my tubes here, which is not what you ever want to do. But if you push it down with enough force, yes, that will fit in. Am I happy with this?
No.
Would I recommend this?
No.
Corsair, if you're watching, please let me know some recommendations of coolers that have shorter tubes. Oh, then you've got these fans as well, don't you? Oh. I mean, I think that's everything. That is all of our RGB, fan speed, everything plugged in. So now it's just a case of, for real Williams, whether you can actually get this in or not. I mean, I'm not happy with the amount of force I need to use to push that down, but hey ho, we'll know if it doesn't work properly. That is now screwed into place. I don't like how this flicks up a little bit. So I guess that means it's done. After all that, kind of like an undramatic ending. And overall, I do like the layout of the case. I think this is a very smart way of doing things because it does give you ample room for everything, yet it doesn't actually take up that much space on your desk. This is a very small enclosure, there's no doubt about it. Just the implementation of radiators, I'm not really a massive fan of. If you have one that's smaller tubes, I think you're going to be absolutely fine. But there's so much room in this chassis. If you can use an air cooler, it's actually probably what I would recommend, because you've got so much ventilation around the side as well and through the front that I don't think it's going to be as much of an issue as it would be in some other chassis. But I would love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you make of Corsair's implementation? Do you like it? Or do you think there's room for improvement? Well, let's take this opportunity to put it back together, shall we? And then, of course, hope it works. I don't like the fact, actually, that when you grip it, this naturally moves around. There should have been like another top piece there or something. But honestly, I think of all the PCs that I build, this is definitely the one I'm praying that it works first time, because I don't want to go back in there. That was not a very pleasant experience, I'll be honest. Oh yeah, how do you actually access the ports? I think you have to turn it over. This little piece comes off, and then you can access all of your I/O. And then there you have your finished PC with the cables trailing at the back. Not bad, just very fiddly. And I hate radiators. Please, please, please work. We're not even going to plug the PC-centric mouse mat today. I just want a signal on the display. But to be fair, it's a good looking chassis, isn't it? That is a nice looking gaming PC. It's clean, it's modern, and you have your RGB on the front if you want as well. It looks promising. That looks good. Yes! I mean, should we pop the hood so you can see what's going on? A load of RGB that you can't actually see. Yes. And I've set it up as well so that the reset button will change the RGB on those Antec fans. There you go, look. So useful in this case. The only thing that's left for us to do is to enable this XMP or X-Pro profile on the RAM. Hopefully make our fans a bit quieter as well. Make sure that's silent. Tune all. And at this point, I'm saving and exiting to Windows, but obviously if you don't have your copy of Windows already installed on your SSD, it's really easy to download from the Windows website. You put that in the back, restart it, and just follow the instructions. So all that's left to say is let's get some games installed and see how the 4060 Ti performs. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it appears we are all set up and ready to go. And I'll start by saying that actually I have made a bit of a mistake that you guys have probably already called out in the comments, and that is that effectively the CPU cooler tubes are now facing upwards, which is not optimal for this at all. And I would say that I could fix it, but the problem is if you bend the tubes the other way, it causes even more of an issue trying to actually sandwich it in. So realistically, I think if you're going to go for an all-in-one, it's worth doing some research into finding a cooler that can actually bend the tubes either at the top or the bottom of the motherboard, which is effectively the left or the right, and you'll be able to get an easier bend, or just find an air cooler that will actually fit into this, and I think your life will be a whole lot easier. But anyway, the RTX 4060 Ti. Let's get gaming. And let us begin with a game that I have been playing the most this year, some Returnal, and this is running at what I would describe as almost unrealistic settings really for this particular card, because this is now running at absolute max, epic, 4K with DLSS set to quality. And to be fair, it's not doing a bad job. Bear in mind this is going to be running at better than console level settings. We're currently getting about 40 to 50 frames a second or so, which is better than the 30 FPS mode that you'll get on consoles, but it's still not really very PC gaming. So what we're going to do is go into the settings, we'll go to graphics, and I think we can actually get a much more playable frame rate just by turning this down to balanced and then turning on DLSS frame generation. This is actually a brand new feature for Returnal in a recent update, and as you can see, it's actually made things worse. How has that happened? Clearly something isn't going on right here, because we've got less FPS and much higher latency. This is not good. So forget all of that, we've restarted the game and we are now back. And again, we're at that 40 to 50 frames a second or so. And once again, we'll go into the settings. We'll show you that actually this is with ray tracing fully enabled as well. So this is definitely not what this 1080p graphics card is marketed for. 4K ray trace gaming, but I am convinced that we will be able to get this to run. Let's set it to performance DLSS first. We'll see what that does to our frame rate, and straight off the bat we're now getting 60 FPS. Granted, this is obviously rendering at 1080p and using AI to upscale, but personally speaking, I don't think I would be remotely bothered if I could play Returnal at 60 FPS at what is really high quality settings at a resolution that genuinely looks fantastic on this 4K monitor and still be able to get, what's that, about 35 milliseconds of latency, 60 FPS. I don't want to spend too much longer on Returnal, so just a couple more tests. This is now running with DLSS set to quality but at 1440p, and you can see that our frame rate is around about 80 frames per second or so, which is pretty darn sick. And if we turn it all the way down to 1080p, you can now see we're surpassing the 100 FPS mark with around about 100 to 110. But let's move on to our multiplayer title now, some Fortnite. And seemingly without any warning at all, we are dropping out of the jet plane, blimp, whatever you want to call it. And as you can see, our frame rate is currently around about 75, 80 frames a second, which isn't too bad until you start to realize, again, we're starting with 4K. And every single time I open up Fortnite, I'm genuinely blown away with how good this looks. This is running with DLSS set to quality, but everything else is set to epic bar nanite that is disabled, and of course no ray trace lighting via lumen. I'm honestly stumped. I genuinely did not expect this to be anywhere close to a proper 4K gaming card. But the fact that it can do this really does beg the question of why you'd want to spend much more money. I mean, yes, obviously you're going to get loads more performance with something like a 4080 or a 4090, but this is definitely something I could get behind. So let's go back into the settings and lower this down to 1440p. And what does that do to the frame rate? It absolutely throws it through the roof. We're now getting about 130 to 165 FPS. And again, this is running epic. So personally, what I would do is turn this down to high and get much closer to the 160 FPS that you typically want on a high refresh rate monitor. But genuinely, I am really impressed with everything that we've got on offer here. I mean, maybe I shouldn't be surprised because of course this is going to be better than the 3060 Ti that it's replacing. It's faster than that, and that was already a fantastic GPU. But it seems that every single video I've made on this current generation has been that the tech is impressive, but the pricing is just a little bit too high. So it's just so nice to finally have something that I can recommend and that is actually available at a decent price. But of course, this is a 1080p graphics card, so let's turn it down to that resolution and see what we get. And what does that do to our frame rate? Well, we're now looking at around about 180 to 200 FPS. So if you did want to pair this with like a crazy high-end 240Hz monitor, you could do that. But personally speaking, I think anything around about 1440p, 165Hz is pretty much going to be the sweet spot for this. And clearly, this is an immensely flexible graphics card that will cope with pretty much any resolution, bar the fact that this does, of course, have 8GB of VRAM, so in the latest and greatest, I think you will run into issues there, but 1080p, 1440p in the vast majority of games, you won't have an issue, and in some, you might just have to turn the textures down. But let us press on now to our next title, and this is going to be a potential issue. This is some Hogwarts Legacy, and the settings we're going to start with are again going to be 4K. This is a game that does support DLSS frame generation, which we're going to turn on. And again, this is a title I'd expect to actually run quite well. We'll leave this at ultra settings, but we'll turn ray tracing off. And immediately, you should be pretty impressed with the frame rate. I mean, just look at this. We're getting around about 85 frames a second on a card that has no real right to be able to run this at 4K at all. This is the power of DLSS. This is the power of frame generation. However, the problem you will start to see as we progress a little bit further into this game is that everything goes wrong very quickly. And this is a telltale sign of what you can expect for a card that has 8GB of VRAM in a game that one might argue isn't very well optimized, or another that this is just a current generation game. This is what's going to be happening going forward. And if you do want to run high resolution with high textures, high settings, this is an example of one of the better problems you can run into. Some games just won't actually work properly at all. Others will have this horrible microstutter. So missing textures and the game being very smooth is actually a more desirable thing. But as you can clearly see, this is pretty unplayable if you do want an overall good-looking, ultra-level experience. But fortunately, you can turn the settings down to high, you can lower down the resolution, and then Hogwarts, it's actually not too bad as long as you're running this either at lower settings or 1080p, but this is a clear example of one of the current titles that 8GB of VRAM isn't really going to be enough if you want to have your cake and eat it, and looking at this 16GB variant is clearly going to be a more desirable option for anyone that does want to play the latest and greatest without any compromises when it comes to VRAM at all. But let's put this a little bit further to the test with a brand new game. This is Dead Island 2, and ironically this was a game code that was actually provided by AMD, and what you're seeing here is running at 4K. This is at high, so not ultra, and this is running with FSR 2 enabled. But again, this is another title that can actually run at 4K. Around about 60 to 70 frames a second is pretty outstanding for a GPU that's marketed for 1080p. And as I say, this is a brand new game. This has just come out, and it doesn't seem like we're getting any horrible stutter or anything associated with any VRAM issues. Not at the moment anyway. I suppose we are running at high, not ultra, but still, the game looks absolutely fantastic. But change the settings we must, because you guys almost certainly want to know how this performs at the lower resolution, so let's turn this down to 1440, I would probably expect nearer 100 frames a second, and yes, okay, that's basically double the frame rate now, around about 132 FPS in Dead Island 2. A brand new game, a brand new GPU, and a glorious frame rate. I mean, what happens if we do turn the settings all the way up now? Let's go for Ultra, and does that make masses of difference? I mean, yeah, I suppose that does. We've lost around about 20, 30 frames a second or so, but for a single player game like this, I say you probably choose the quality over the smoothness. So I guess the only thing that's left to do is to turn this down to 1080p, and as you'd expect, it has increased. Not quite as dramatically as we saw with 4K to 1440, but still around about 150 FPS, max settings. Don't think anyone's going to have any complaints there. But anyway, the question very much goes out to you on this. What do you make of our rig, our case, our GPU? Will you be buying one? Do you think it's disappointing? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, so do let me know. Smash the like button if you've enjoyed this, get yourself subscribed, and of course, as always, if you do want to check out current pricing on anything featured in this video, you can find it linked down below with my Amazon affiliate links. Thank you so much for watching this video. We'll catch you in the next one.